What would you do if a simple flight home turned into a nightmare? When Tasha and her 8-year-old daughter Amara boarded their plane, they expected nothing more than a quiet journey back to Chicago. But beneath the polite smiles of flight attendant Marcy lay a simmering prejudice that quickly turned deadly. When a spilled soda and cruel words escalated into threats, Tasha found herself cornered, until off-duty FBI agent Bryce Lang intervened. With tension crackling at 30,000 feet and justice hanging by a thread, Tasha must decide. Will she stay silent or fight back against a world eager to dismiss her? The airport buzzed with the usual chaos of an early morning. Wheels of suitcases rattled against the polished floors. Overhead speakers called out boarding groups, and the smell of coffee mingled with the recycled air. Among the rush, 8-year-old Amara clung to her mother's hand, her tiny fingers tight around the worn strap of her purple unicorn backpack. Her brown eyes darted around, equal parts curious and overwhelmed. "Stay close, baby," her mother Tasha whispered. She tried to keep her voice steady, but exhaustion hung over her like a fog. It had been a long week visiting Tasha's ailing mother, and all she wanted now was to get back home. Back to the comfort of their small but cozy apartment, away from the sharp stares and whispered judgments they had endured during their visit to the mostly white town of Barstow. Their flight was nearly ready to board. Tasha fumbled with the boarding passes, balancing her purse, a tote bag, and a crumpled juice box that Amara had finished hours ago. The gate attendant, a young woman with a forced smile, barely glanced at Tasha as she gestured them forward. Amara's small feet skipped along the jet bridge, her excitement momentarily washing away her tiredness. She loved flying. The thrill of takeoff, the clouds so close they seemed like they could touch them. She bounced ahead, and Tasha had to quicken her step to keep up. But the warmth of the moment shattered as they stepped onto the plane. A flight attendant with platinum blonde hair and lips painted a severe red stood near the door. Her name tag read Marcy. Her smile didn't reach her icy blue eyes as she greeted passengers, her voice sugar-sweet to everyone, until Tasha and Amara approached. Marcy's eyes narrowed, and her lips tightened into a thin line. She glanced at Amara, then at Tasha, her expression sliding into something cold and condescending. "Back of the plane," Marcy said, her voice sharp. Tasha hesitated, confusion rippling through her. Our seats are in row 12, she said, holding out the boarding passes. Marcy didn't even look at them. "I said, back of the plane. We're full up front." Other passengers edged past them, their eyes averted. Tasha felt a flush creep up her neck, a familiar blend of shame and anger. She opened her mouth to protest, but Amara tugged at her sleeve. "It's okay, Mommy," she whispered. "We can sit anywhere." Tasha swallowed her words. She guided Amara down the narrow aisle, her shoulders hunched against the weight of stairs she could feel but not see. Row 12 sat empty, but Marcy's glare burned into the back of Tasha's head. Tasha kept moving, finally finding 2 seats near the restroom, the persistent hum of the engines loud and unkind. Amara climbed into her seat, her feet dangling and kicking gently against the underside of the chair. She pulled out her favorite book, the edges worn from love, and began to read. Tasha exhaled slowly, her fingers gripping the armrest. It would be okay. They just needed to get home. But things only got worse. As the plane filled, Marcy made several passes down the aisle. Her interactions with other passengers were polite, even warm. She helped an elderly couple stow their bags, offered a lollipop to a fussy toddler. But when her eyes landed on Amara, the mask slipped. Amara had unbuckled her seatbelt to reach for the backpack under the seat. Marcy was there in an instant, towering over the little girl. "Sit down and stay seated," Marcy barked. Her voice sliced through the air, and Amara flinched. The book slipped from her hands, its pages splaying open on the floor. "I'm sorry," Amara said quickly, her voice small. She scrambled to pick up the book, but Marcy's foot shot out, pinning it to the floor. Tasha's heart pounded. She rose halfway out of her seat. "Hey, there's no need for that." Marcy didn't even look at her. She leaned closer to Amara, her expression twisted. "Didn't your mother teach you how to behave in public?" Tasha's voice turned steely. I said stop it. Finally, Marcy turned, her face smoothed over, a practiced smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Ma'am, if you can't control your child, I'll have to ask the captain to remove you from the flight. Amara's eyes filled with tears. She bit her lip, trying to be brave, but the words had cut deep. Tasha opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, a deep, steady voice rose from a few rows ahead. Is there a problem here? Heads turned. A man in a well-worn leather jacket stood up, his broad shoulders almost brushing the overhead compartment. His gaze was calm but unwavering, and there was something in the set of his jaw that silenced the entire cabin. Marcy's demeanor shifted instantly. No problem, sir. Just handling a disruptive passenger. The man's eyes moved from Marcy to Tasha, then to Amara. His expression softened. I've been watching. That little girl hasn't done a thing wrong. Marcy bristled. I assure you, I'm an off-duty FBI agent, he cut in, pulling out a worn leather badge. And I suggest you back off before this becomes a bigger issue. For the first time, Marcy hesitated. The color drained from her face, and she took a step back, her polished exterior cracking. The agent moved closer, his voice dropping low. If I see one more sign of harassment or discrimination, I'll make sure this flight never leaves the ground. Understood? Marcy nodded stiffly. Without another word, she turned and marched back up the aisle, her shoulders rigid. The agent knelt down to Amara's level, his expression gentle. Hey there, are you okay? Amara nodded, wiping at her cheeks. Thank you, mister, he smiled. You're welcome, and don't let anyone make you feel small, okay? Tasha reached out, her voice breaking. Thank you. I don't even know your name. Bryce, he said, and don't worry, I'll be keeping an eye out. As Bryce returned to his seat, the tension in the cabin slowly eased. Tasha pulled Amara into a hug, whispering soft reassurances. The hum of the engine smoothed into a calmer rhythm, and for the first time since they had boarded, Tasha felt a glimmer of safety. But the flight was far from over, and Marcy's cold stare from the front of the plane promised that the worst might still be yet to come. The plane jolted as it taxied onto the runway, and Tasha tightened her grip on Amara's hand. She could still feel the cold echo of Marcy's glare, like frost creeping under her skin. Bryce, the off-duty FBI agent, sat just a few rows ahead, his posture relaxed, but his eyes ever watchful. His presence was a thin blanket of safety, but Tasha knew all too well how quickly things could unravel. Amara nestled into her seat, her book resting in her lap. The flight had barely begun, yet the little girl's earlier excitement had withered into silence. Tasha stroked her daughter's hair, murmuring soft words, wishing she could build a wall between Amara and the harshness of the world. The plane ascended, tilting into the gray sky. Seatbelts clicked open as passengers settled in, some slipping on headphones, others flipping through in-flight magazines. Tasha reached for the complimentary water bottle, her throat dry. She hadn't realized how fast her heart was beating until the cool plastic met her palm. Marcy reappeared, her presence an unwelcome shadow. She moved down the aisle with a forced smile, handing out snacks and drinks, her red lips stretched too tight. Tasha's stomach tightened as the flight attendant drew closer, each step a reminder that trouble still lingered. Would you like a drink? Marcy's voice held an edge as she addressed the passenger beside Tasha, a middle-aged man who barely looked up from his tablet. Marcy's hand hovered over the snack cart, and her eyes flicked to Amara. The practiced smile slipped, leaving behind a sneer. She held out a can of soda and a packet of pretzels to Tasha, her fingers lingering just out of reach. Tasha extended her hand, and just as her fingers brushed the cold metal of the can, Marcy let go. The soda dropped, bursting open as it hit the floor. A spray of sticky liquid splattered Amara's shoes and the hem of Tasha's jeans. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Marcy cooed, her tone a mockery of concern. "I guess some people just can't handle simple tasks." Tasha's breath caught in her throat. She bit down the sharp retort on the edge of her tongue, knowing it would only make things worse. She reached into her tote bag, pulling out a handful of tissues and dabbing at Amara's sneakers. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, but the sting in her voice betrayed her. Marcy didn't move. She stood there, a statue of superiority, as if waiting for Tasha to make a wrong move. Other passengers were starting to notice, a ripple of unease spreading through the rows. Some turned away, their faces pressed against windows or buried in books. Others glanced over with pity, a look Tasha despised almost as much as the disdain in Marcy's eyes. Bryce shifted in his seat. His hand rested casually on the armrest, but his expression was anything but relaxed. His eyes locked on Marcy, a silent warning. She caught his stare and, for a moment, something vulnerable flashed across her face. She grabbed the snack cart handle and moved on, her movements jerky. Amara's lower lip trembled. "Mommy, did I do something wrong?" "No, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong." Tasha's voice wavered. "Sometimes people are just mean." Amara nodded, her small fingers curling into the fabric of her backpack. The light in her eyes had dimmed, and Tasha felt a fresh wave of anger. She wanted to lash out, to demand respect, to shield her daughter from the ugliness of the world. But years of experience had taught her the cost of speaking up, of making herself a target. The flight dragged on. The cabin lights dimmed, and a movie played silently on the overhead screens. The hum of the engines was a backdrop to Tasha's restless thoughts. She wanted to sleep, to drift away from the tightness in her chest, but every time she closed her eyes, Marcy's face loomed in the dark. Bryce got up at one point, his tall frame unfolding as he moved toward the restroom. He paused by Tasha's row, his voice a low murmur. "You okay?" Tasha nodded, but the tightness in her throat turned the gesture into a lie. "Yeah, thank you for earlier." "No need to thank me." He glanced toward the front of the plane, where Marcy had disappeared behind the curtain. "I'm keeping an eye on things." He moved on, and Tasha felt a little of the weight lift. It was enough, just barely, to keep her steady. But the reprieve was short-lived. When Marcy returned, her smile was gone entirely. She leaned over Tasha's seat, her voice a harsh whisper. "If you cause one more problem, I'll have you removed when we land. And don't think anyone will take your side." Tasha recoiled. "What are you talking about? I haven't done anything." Marcy's fingers tightened around the edge of the seat, her knuckles pale. "People like you always play the victim, always think the rules don't apply, but I know your type." Heat flooded Tasha's cheeks. She opened her mouth to respond, but a sharp tug at her sleeve stopped her. Amara's eyes were wide, fear etched into every line of her small face. Tasha swallowed her words, bile rising in her throat. She watched as Marcy straightened, smoothing the front of her uniform, and walked away with a sway that felt like a threat. For the rest of the flight, Tasha sat stiffly, every muscle taut. She whispered quiet stories to Amara, trying to replace the harshness with warmth, but every minute stretched too long. The clouds outside the window drifted by, indifferent to the battle being fought at 30,000 feet. As the plane began its descent, Tasha's hope that the ordeal might end with landing flickered. But deep down, she knew Marcy wasn't finished, and as the wheels touched down, a sinking dread coiled in her stomach. The storm wasn't over, it had only just begun. The plane shuddered as its wheels kissed the tarmac, the heavy thud echoing through Tasha's bones. She forced herself to breathe, her fingers still laced tightly with Amara's. Outside the window, rain smeared the world into gray streaks, the airport a blurred collection of lights and concrete. The passengers around them stirred to life, unbuckling seat belts and reaching for bags. For most, the journey was over. For Tasha, it felt like it had only just begun. Marcy's voice crackled over the intercom, still sweet despite the venom beneath. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop. Welcome to Chicago." Amara shifted in her seat, the seatbelt pressing against her small chest. "Are we getting off now, Mommy?" "Soon, baby. Just sit tight." Tasha forced a smile, but the tightness in her cheeks made it feel like a mask. She could see Marcy at the front of the plane, talking to another flight attendant, her gestures sharp and animated. Every now and then, Marcy's eyes flicked back toward Tasha and Amara, a thin-lipped smirk curling her mouth. Bryce remained seated as well, his broad shoulders angled toward the aisle. He had his phone in hand, but his gaze was fixed forward, a quiet sentinel. As soon as the seatbelt sign dinged off, Marcy moved. She marched down the aisle, bypassing the impatient passengers who had already begun pulling bags from the overhead compartments. Her destination was clear. "Ma'am, I need you to remain seated," Marcy ordered, her voice loud enough to draw attention. Tasha felt the weight of curious eyes. What's going on? "There's a situation," Marcy said, the mock professionalism back in place. "Security will be meeting you at the gate." Amara's grip on Tasha's hand tightened, her knuckles white. "Mommy?" "It's okay, sweetie." Tasha's voice trembled. "We haven't done anything wrong." Marcy's expression twisted. "We'll see about that." Bryce was on his feet in an instant. "Hold on a second. What's the issue here?" "This is none of your concern, sir," Marcy snapped, her voice losing its sweetness. "Oh. It became my concern when you started harassing this family." Bryce's tone was calm, but beneath it lay a thread of steel. He reached into his jacket, pulling out his FBI badge once more. "You need to be very careful about how you proceed." Marcy's face blanched, but her stubbornness held. They were being disruptive. The child wasn't following instructions, and the mother has been confrontational. A murmur spread through the surrounding passengers, a ripple of confusion and disbelief. A young woman in a hoodie leaned forward. "I've been sitting right here. They didn't do anything." "Yeah," added an older man across the aisle. "That little girl has been quiet the whole flight." Marcy's composure cracked, a fine line running through her porcelain demeanor. "If you all want to get involved, fine, but I've already called security." Tasha's pulse thundered in her ears. She could almost see it. The men in uniforms, the questioning, the humiliation. How quickly things could spiral, how easily lies could become truths in the wrong hands. Bryce stepped closer to Marcy, his height forcing her to tilt her head up. "You realize the consequences of making a false report, don't you?" Her lip curled. "You think you can intimidate me?" "No," he said quietly. "But I can make sure this doesn't get buried. I can make sure there are witnesses, documentation. You're playing a dangerous game." Marcy hesitated. Her bravado wavered as the walls closed in, the passengers watching with varying degrees of judgment. The power she wielded as a flight attendant was slipping through her fingers. She spun on her heel, pushing past the crowd, and disappeared into the front galley. Bryce crouched beside Tasha and Amara, his voice dropping to a softer tone. "I'm not letting anything happen to you. When we get off this plane, I'll walk with you. If security is waiting, I'll handle it." Tasha nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you. I don't even know why this is happening." "Because some people think they can get away with anything," he said. "But not today." The line of passengers finally began to move. As they stood, Bryce remained close, his presence a buffer against the rising tide of fear. Amara clung to Tasha's side, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized backpack. When they reached the front of the plane, Marcy was gone. The other flight attendant avoided eye contact, her cheeks flushed with discomfort. The jet bridge was cold, the air biting. Tasha's breath clouded in front of her as they stepped into the terminal. And there they were, two uniformed airport security officers standing rigid by the gate. Their radios crackled and one of them raised a hand, signaling for Tasha to stop. Bryce moved in front of them. "I'm Special Agent Bryce Lang, FBI. I need to know exactly what this is about." The lead officer hesitated, his hand dropping to his belt where a black baton rested. "We got a call about a disruptive passenger. We were told there was a safety concern." "Who made the call?" Bryce's voice was all business now, sharp and commanding. The officer checked his notes. "A flight attendant, Marcy Green." "Of course," Bryce muttered. He turned to Tasha. "Stay right here." He approached the officers, speaking in low tones. The conversation was a dance of clipped words and exchanged glances. Tasha couldn't hear, but she saw the way the officers' postures shifted, their initial wariness softening into uncertainty. One of the officers approached. His face was kind, his voice measured. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for the confusion. It seems there's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding." Tasha's voice wavered, anger mixing with relief. "She lied." The officer nodded slowly. "We're going to look into it. If you'd like to file a formal complaint, we can take your statement." Bryce placed a steadying hand on Tasha's shoulder. "I'll make sure it's done right." Tasha exhaled, the weight finally starting to lift. She glanced down at Amara, who looked up at her with a mix of exhaustion and hope. "Can we go home now, Mommy?" "Yes, baby, we're going home." And as they walked away from the gate, surrounded by the bustling anonymity of the airport, Tasha felt the pull of gravity ease, the promise of safety finally within reach. But beneath it all, the simmering knowledge remained. This fight wasn't over. Not yet. As they moved through the bustling terminal, Tasha's senses felt razor sharp, every sound and movement amplified. Amara stayed close, her tiny hands still clutching Tasha's, while Bryce walked just a step behind, his presence a quiet shield. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, and Tasha could feel the lingering glances from passers-by. The curious, the indifferent, the judgmental. She kept her head high, each step a defiance against the weight of what had just happened. The airport's main atrium unfolded ahead of them, a cavernous space filled with the endless shuffle of travelers. Tasha reached into her tote bag for her phone, her fingers clumsy as she swiped through the screen. She needed to call someone, her sister maybe, or a friend. But the words seemed stuck, tangled up with the disbelief and exhaustion. Bryce guided them toward a quieter seating area near a bank of windows. Rain streaked down the glass, the outside world a wash of silver and gray. He sat down beside Tasha, folding his long legs beneath the small metal table. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a quiet storm. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked. Tasha nodded, though her pulse still raced. I can't believe that happened. I didn't do anything wrong." "You didn't," Bryce assured her. "I've seen it before. People in positions of power thinking they can get away with anything. She thought you were an easy target." Amara fidgeted with the zipper on her backpack, her face a mask of confusion. "Mommy, why did that lady hate us?" The question sliced through the air, raw and unfiltered. Tasha's throat tightened. She didn't want to explain the ugly truth to her daughter, didn't want to shatter the delicate shield of innocence that Amara still carried. But how could she avoid it when the world had already shown its hand? "Sometimes people are just mean, sweetheart," she said softly. "It's not because of anything you did. It's because of something wrong inside them." Amara's brows knitted together, her small mind working through the answer. She nodded slowly, her fingers still tracing the worn unicorn patch on her backpack. A few minutes passed in silence, the airport's noise a dull hum in the background. Bryce pulled out his phone, his thumbs tapping against the screen. "I just sent a message to a contact at the airline," he said. "I want to make sure Marcy's actions are documented. The witnesses on the plane might help too." "Do you think they'll listen?" Tasha asked, her voice thin. "Or will they just sweep it under the rug?" "They'll listen." His tone was firm, and if they don't, I know people who can make sure they do. Tasha's shoulders relaxed a fraction. She had spent so much of her life being told to be quiet, to keep her head down. It was strange to have someone fight for her, someone who believed her without question. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. It's the least I could do." Bryce's face softened, a hint of a smile breaking through. "You two didn't deserve any of that." A chime from the airport intercom broke the moment. A flight to Denver was boarding at a nearby gate, the attendant's voice bright and detached. The world was moving on, indifferent to what had just unraveled. Bryce stood, slipping his phone back into his jacket. "Do you have a ride home?" Tasha blinked, the reality of the situation crashing back. I was going to take a cab. I need to get home. Let me call you a car, he offered. Something safe. I'll make sure you get home without any more trouble. She hesitated, pride and practicality warring inside her, but the truth was, she was exhausted. Her mind and body ached, and the thought of navigating the busy streets alone felt insurmountable. Okay, she agreed, her voice small. Bryce made a quick call, his words smooth and efficient. When he finished, he turned back to Amara, his expression gentle. You like unicorns? Amara's eyes brightened just a little. Uh-huh. I got this backpack for my birthday. It's a very cool backpack, he said. You know, my daughter used to love unicorns too. Amara's head tilted. Used to? She doesn't like them anymore? No, I guess she grew out of them, he said, a shadow crossing his face. She's all about soccer now. I can barely keep up. Tasha saw it, the flicker of pain beneath his words. She had assumed Bryce was just a man doing the right thing, but now she glimpsed something more. A story beneath the surface, a depth she hadn't expected. Before she could ask, a black sedan pulled up outside, its sleek lines blurred by the rain. Bryce stood and helped gather their bags, his movements practiced and unhurried. The driver stepped out, a young woman with a bright smile who opened the door and greeted them warmly. Bryce handed her a few bills, murmuring something too quiet for Tasha to hear. Thank you again, Tasha said as she and Amara settled into the back seat. You've done more than you needed to. Bryce leaned into the open window, the rain catching in his hair. Just take care of yourselves. And if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to call. He handed her a card, plain white with a simple phone number printed in black. No name, no title, just a line of digits. Tasha tucked it into her bag, a lifeline folded between the pages of receipts and loose change. As the car pulled away, she watched Bryce through the rain-streaked window. He stood there until they merged into traffic, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he was just a blur among the crowd. Tasha leaned back, her head resting against the cool glass. Amara's breathing had slowed, her eyes half closed as the day's weight finally pulled her under. The city unfolded around them, a maze of concrete and steel, and beneath the quiet hum of the car, Tasha felt a spark, tiny, fragile, but real. The spark of something more than survival, the spark of hope. But even as they neared home, she couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't over, that Marcy's cruelty was only a symptom of something deeper, and that if she wanted to protect her daughter, not just today but always, she couldn't let this go unanswered. The fight wasn't just behind them, it was ahead too. The sedan slipped through the wet streets, the city lights smearing into neon trails against the windows. Tasha watched as familiar landmarks passed by, the weight in her chest slowly giving way to something warmer. Home was close now, and with it, a chance to finally breathe. Amara had drifted into a light sleep, her head resting against Tasha's arm. Tasha stroked her daughter's braids gently, her mind replaying the events of the day. She wanted to wash it away, the sting of Marcy's words, the tight grip of fear, but the memory clung like a stain. Her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her bag, squinting at the screen. An unknown number. For a moment she considered ignoring it, but instinct nudged her to answer. Hello? Mrs. Harper? This is James Adler from Kensington Airlines. The voice was calm, professional. I wanted to reach out personally regarding the incident on your flight today. Tasha's pulse quickened. Oh, yes? We received a formal complaint from Special Agent Bryce Lang, as well as several passenger statements. I want to assure you that we are taking this matter very seriously. The words flowed smoothly, but Tasha had heard promises before, empty assurances that smoothed over problems without fixing them. What does that mean exactly? It means Ms. Green has been suspended pending a full investigation, he said. We're also offering you and your daughter a formal apology, along with compensation for the distress caused. Compensation. The word felt hollow, but Tasha held onto it. I appreciate that, but what about real accountability? She shouldn't be allowed to treat anyone else this way. There will be accountability, Mrs. Harper, Adler promised. If the investigation confirms misconduct, Ms. Green will no longer work for our airline. We'll also be conducting additional training for our staff to ensure this kind of behavior isn't tolerated. Tasha hesitated. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Okay, thank you. After a few more exchanges, she ended the call. Her reflection stared back at her in the darkened window, the shadows of exhaustion etched into her features. But beneath it all, a spark of satisfaction glowed. She had been heard. The car pulled up in front of their apartment building. The brick facade loomed against the rainy sky, its worn edges softened by the golden glow of the lobby lights. Tasha nudged Amara awake, and the little girl stirred, blinking sleepily. "We're home, baby." They stepped out into the drizzle, the cool air a gentle shock. Tasha thanked the driver, her words spilling with genuine gratitude. She took Amara's hand, and together they climbed the worn stone steps to their door. Inside, the apartment was just as they had left it, cozy and cluttered, the remains of their rushed departure still visible in the unwashed breakfast dishes and the pile of laundry waiting by the bedroom door. But it was home, and for the first time all day, Tasha felt the tightness in her chest begin to unwind. She ran a bath for Amara, filling the tub with warm water and lavender bubbles. As the little girl splashed and giggled, Tasha sat on the edge, her fingers trailing through the suds. It was a sound she wanted to bottle up and keep forever, the proof that despite everything, her daughter's joy remained intact. When Amara was tucked into bed, her unicorn backpack resting beside her pillow, Tasha sat at the kitchen table. She pulled out Bryce's card, the simple black digit staring back at her. She didn't need to call him, not now, but she liked knowing the option was there, that someone outside her world cared enough to give her a safety net. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Bryce. "Heard from the airline. Sounds like things are moving in the right direction. If you need help with anything else, just say the word." Tasha typed back a quick response. "Thank you. We're home safe. I'll let you know if we need anything." She set the phone down and wrapped her hands around a steaming cup of tea. The rain pattered against the window, a soothing rhythm that filled the quiet. She thought of Marcy, of the look in her eyes, the hate so raw it had slipped out despite all her practiced smiles. Tasha had seen it before, in different forms, different faces. It was a sickness, one that lingered in shadows and flared up when given the chance. But not this time. This time, someone had pushed back. Her tea cooled as the minutes drifted by. She allowed herself to think about the future, not just the immediate needs of laundry and groceries, but the larger picture. What kind of world would Amara grow up in? What more could Tasha do to make it safer, kinder? She didn't have all the answers, but the questions felt like a start. Maybe she would write a letter, not just to the airline, but to advocacy groups, to her community, to anyone who might listen. She wasn't a fighter by nature, but for Amara, she could learn. The next morning, when the rain had cleared and the sun crept over the city's rooftops, Tasha woke to the sound of soft laughter. She found Amara in the living room, building a fort out of blankets and pillows, her unicorn backpack perched on top like a flag. "Mommy, look! It's our castle!" Tasha knelt beside her, running a hand over the soft fabric walls. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." "Are we safe here?" Amara asked, her voice light but the question heavy. Tasha wrapped her arms around her daughter, pulling her close. "Yes, baby, we are safe, and no one can ever take that away from us." As they sat together, surrounded by the fragile walls of their blanket castle, Tasha felt the truth of her words settle deep in her bones. Safety wasn't just a place, it was a promise, one she intended to keep, no matter what. And as the sun filled their small home with light, the shadows of yesterday finally began to fade.